You know, Dr. Tsegaye, one of the things that just baffles me to no ends is the fact that I've been told that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is an Oromo. And, you know, the Oromo community ushered him into power on their shoulders. And immediately upon being put in a position of power, he bombed the Oromo people. Like, he bombed the Oromo people. And as, you know, in democracy, you get behind your candidates, you get behind your party, you work, you push, and you do it in a democratic way. And so I can only imagine the Oromo people saw their future in the work they were doing, bringing someone up that is a part of the Oromo culture, and then immediately upon accepting power says, I want to go back to the old ways. And when you look at the old ways in Ethiopian history, in recent history, you got to go to the Derg. I mean, I don't know if that's what you're talking about. And then before that, you got to go to a monarch. I mean, there's nothing that even resembles democracy going back. What if, in fact, Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, is Oromo, and the first thing he did was bomb his own people? What does that do to the psyche and the energy and the promise and the hope of the Oromo people?
It's very interesting that he actually used the Oromo platform, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, to get to this position. And when he was brought into this position, the Oromo people didn't know him much. They knew another leader of the OPDO. His name is Lemma Magarsa. He was then the president of Oromia region. He is the guy who said, okay, we understand your plight. The demands of the young people is legitimate. We will try to address that as soon as possible. We do that or ignore it at our own peril. And we need to have a deep reform within the government. And we will try to address the demands of the Oromo young people, the Kero. And we will, if we can't, we will struggle with you. The moment he said that, he sided with the protesters. And the protesters said, this is our man, we'll give him a chance. And we, who were kind of coordinating the social media activism of the protest, said, okay, if someone takes our side, it's up to us now, trying to take that change, that reform on track and try to see if democratic transition is possible. So we wrote, I myself wrote an article about the hope of transformation from within, a hope or mirage. You know, my friend Ezekiel Gabisa wrote a number of articles about, is the OPDO the last best hope for democracy in Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. So for once, the Oromo had this prospect of enjoying democracy and probably achieving self-determination if the young people in political leadership in the establishment, such as Lemma Magarsa, are going to side with the Oromo protest movement. And that was the ticket of Abiy to take up the Oromo garb and assume the highest, the power in the highest office. So when he came under the shadow of Lemma Magarsa. He didn't have anything to say. We didn't know exactly where he stands vis-a-vis the Oromo protest movement, the demands of the people. We didn't know anything about his idea and his vision for Ethiopia, for a democratic transition. We just didn't know. But people trusted Lemma Magarsa, and Lemma brought him in because this guy was already a member of parliament, in a democratically elected parliament, of course. So he came here, and people said, okay, as long as Lemma is there, and as long as people like Jawar and the other Oromo political leaders are keeping him on track towards a democratic election come 2020, maybe we will see. So the Oromo public suspended their hope up until the election of 2020. And that's why the postponement of the election in 2020 is an explosive moment for Oromo protest once again. Because they really said, okay, whatever happens, we will tolerate it until the election, and we'll kick out this man, and we'll have the chance to achieve our self-determination. But that didn't happen. And he knew that the Oromo is going to be his first spot of opposition. What we didn't know also is the fact that he buys into a different vision of Ethiopia. And we talked about treason, and we talked about reneging on the demands of the constitution. The reason for that is Abiy Ahmed has a completely different vision for Ethiopia than the one that is put in the constitution. And in fact, his first attempt in political maneuvering is tinkering with the constitution. He says, I want to change the constitution to repeal the federal structure that we have now. He says, I want to change the constitution to repeal the self-determination clause of the constitution. And I want to change the constitution by repealing the rights of self-determination of nations and nationalities and peoples. In fact, he said, I want to change the constitution in such a way that no one will conduct politics associated around or organized around his or her own ethnicity or national groups. Okay? So that means a complete reversal of what was going on for the last 27 years. Now, the constitution was negotiated by the different nationalist groups, mainly TPLF, OLF, and other groups in between 1991 and 1995, as a constitution, as a document that encapsulates and actualizes the right of the different groups in Ethiopia to self-determination. People have to have their region, their own homeland to govern by themselves. People have to have enjoy their culture, enjoy the dignity in their culture and in their identity. People have to use their languages in public services, in the administration, in education, and in judicial offices. And these were basically the three major components of self-determination: self-governance at the local level, okay, use of language, culture, and identity in their own areas, and control over their homeland. These were the things in the constitution. And these were basically the demands of the Oromo protest. And Abiy Ahmed comes to power and he says, these are bad things for Ethiopia. We have to do away with this, and we have to really ennoble the old Ethiopia. In fact, the first inaugural speech he made was he said in parliament, now is the time for us to go back to the glory of the olden days. And that was the moment I said, what glory of the olden days is he talking about? Because in our history is a history of agony for some and ecstasy for others. As someone said, the agony and ecstasy of Ethiopian history. I think it was Ivo Straker, a German anthropologist, who wrote a piece entitled The Agony and Ecstasy of Ethiopian History. And Ethiopian history is embodied with this kind of agony and ecstasy. And when you talk about the glory of the past, whose glory are we talking about? And of course, that leads you back to the time of the Derg, that leads you back to the time of the monarchy. And those days are glory only for some, not for all. And these people who have been hoping to get some sense of dignity and self-determination at last were completely, were let down, and they felt betrayed by Abiy Ahmed's promise of democratic transition. So that's.
I'm hearing a couple of things that I want you to chime in on, because that sounds exactly like the playbook of Make America Great Again.
Absolutely.
And then also the description of what democracy is sounds like Isaias F. Workey saying we have a different ideal of what African democracy is. And exactly how you are describing the vision of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, it looks a lot like Eritrea's notion of government. And I really don't understand let me ask, do you believe that this will be a successful attempt, or will it be thwarted? Can Abiy Ahmed be brought in? Do you get to just tamper with the Constitution? You're a constitutional scholar. Is there a way where the prime minister just gets to come in and tinker with the Constitution? Is there like a Senate? Is there like a House? Is there a share of power, or it sounds like here's a dictator in your midst doing exactly what everyone fought against, emerging once again. I know I threw a lot out there, Dr. Tsegaye, but you just pick in and choose any of that you'd like to take a swing at.
It is true in terms of democracy, in terms of doing politics in the public life today. A colleague of mine, Tagaru, once said, we are seeing the Eritreanization of Ethiopian politics. And you're right in saying that we are more looking like Eritrea now in terms of whether we are going to have election or not, whether we are going to enjoy democracy or not, etc., etc. I think there is a lot of emulation of Isaias on the part of Abiy, a lot of mimicking of Isaias in the way he does politics, and that is very, very unfortunate. Isaias has always been on the side of centralization, on the side of suppression of plurality within his own country. There are about 9 to 10 ethnic groups, as you know, in Eritrea. And he said, we are not going to give any political expression to these ethnic identities in Eritrea. And in the same way, he's been on record saying several times that I have advised against the Ethiopian leaders, beginning from Prime Minister Meles on, that they are not going to give any political expression to the ethno-national identities in the country, because that will lead to disintegration. But what he didn't understand, or he probably overlooked, is the fact that when the groups fought against the Derg, the Tigrayan peoples, the Oromo peoples, the Kambata peoples, the Hadia, all sorts of peoples, the Gambela, Benishangul Gumuz, the Anywa, the Berta, the Gumuz, and so on and so forth. When they fought against the Derg, in tandem with Eritreans who were fighting for self-determination for 17 years during the Derg time, they were basically saying the idea of a centralized Ethiopia, the idea of a unitary regime in Ethiopia, is an idea whose time is gone, an idea that has failed to keep the country together, an idea that has failed to bring about social justice to the country, especially to the people who have been invisible, who are the unknown faces of Ethiopia, including Eritrea itself. Back then it was part of Ethiopia, but Ethiopia, for all intents and purposes, were Amhara, even then. One of the reasons Eritreans wanted to secede was because they hated the centralization that came about after the dissolution of the Eritrean Federation in 1960. There was, the United Nations joined Eritrea in 1952, joined Eritrea to the Ethiopian Empire on federalist terms. They were part of a federation, the Ethio-Eritrean Federation. For 10 years, between 1952 and 1960, Ethiopia and Eritrea were bound together in a federation. In 1960, the Ethiopian monarch, Haile Selassie, dissolved the federation. When the federation dissolved, military armed struggle started in Eritrea. They said, the federal arrangement is the basic minimum for us to stay together. Because they had their own parliament, their own political parties, they had their own Bill of Rights in their own constitution, and the other parts of Ethiopia did not have that. And when the federation was dissolved, they have lost all that kind of right, and the country was becoming more and more centralized. And it was that suffocating centralization that they resisted. And likewise, all the other groups in Ethiopia were resisting that beginning from the 1960s. And in fact, the famous Ethiopian student movement flagged the issue of the question of nationalities as of 1969. A famous student leader called Walelin wrote a small left-oriented pamphlet called the Nationalities Question in Ethiopia. When the 1974 revolution emerged, it was obvious that you cannot continue to keep Ethiopia together through a centralist unitary vision with the Amhara cultural and political class at the top and everybody else underneath, related hierarchically to one another. That used to be the past, the imperial past that Abiy now wants to get us back to. It is a hierarchical relationship. It was a ranked relationship. It was sometimes a racialized, ranked relationship. If you look at in Ethiopia, there is the Ethiopian, which is mainly the Amhara, the light-colored people, and then there is the Galla, the Oromo, underneath, and then there is the Gudella, the various other southern nations peoples, and then there is the Shankilla, the dark-faced people meant only for slavery, the darker-faced people of the darker complexion, most of them inhabiting the western and southwestern territories, peripheries of Ethiopia. The Anuak, the Nuer, the Berta, the Gumuz, okay? And some of the people in the southern Oromo region of what is called southern nations and nationalities and peoples. So this was the hierarchical relationship that we had in Ethiopia. That was the relationship. It was a ranked relationship among groups before 1974. And the 1974 revolution, while it was a class revolution in the main, the motto was land to the tiller. And it was also a revolution for self-determination for various national groups. Okay? So in 1987, even by the Derg constitution, the right of nationalities to self-determination, the right of nationalities to use their language was already recognized. Although, because the Derg was a totalitarian regime, that wasn't going to come to anything at all, anything meaningful. So that was what we had. Now, when in 1991, another revolution happened, which is now mainly led by the TPLF from the north and the EPLF from Eritrea, it was clearly, purely a revolution conducted on behalf of self-determination of various groups. It was for once the periphery coming to the center to negotiate a new country. In fact, that's what the constitution says. We, the nations and nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia, exercising our right to self-determination, considering the fact that we had an even historical relationship, with the hope that we will rectify that unjust relationship and to build a lasting peace. We have come together to establish this constitution. If you look at the constitution and if you look at the politics that preceded the constitution, it was a politics that was conducted purely on behalf of the right of groups to self-determination. And it is that revolution that Abiy Ahmed wants to reverse. How does he do it? He wanted to tinker with the constitution. We had no problem with tinkering the constitution. Constitutions get amended and we need to amend them. But myself, Jawar, and every other opposition group has been saying, let's do the constitutional amendment process according to the rules of the constitution after a democratic transition is achieved, which means we'll have a legitimate parliament in place. We will have a House of Federation, which is in charge of constitutional interpretation in place. We'll have a democratic legislatures in all other regions. Then we will table an agenda for constitutional amendment, whichever it is, an agenda for constitutional amendment. When we do, according to the constitution, amendment can be effected in these ways. First, you will have to have a approval from both houses at the federal level, both houses, meaning the House of Federation and the House of People's Representatives, meaning the equivalent of the Senate and the Congress. Okay. Then we'll have to have at least the approval of the amendment by at least 6 out of the 9 states constituting the Federation. 2/3 of the states have to approve the amendment. And so we said, for all this to happen, for the amendments that Abiy wants to happen, we need first to transition to democracy. Let's have the members of the regional parliaments and the federal parliament elected by the people. Once the people have elected their representatives, let those representatives table the agenda of amendment. And then let that amendment process take its constitutional course by going all the way from the federal houses to the regional houses and getting approval in that manner. This will help us a really smooth transition to a different dispensation, if you want a different dispensation than the one that is self-determination. Unfortunately, he wasn't listening. And we said, okay, fine. Let him pursue this agenda of reunification of Ethiopia. If he is let go, if he is allowed to do it unimpeded by any one of us, we said he would hit the wall. Because once the wheels of federalism have started to run, once people have started to exercise some degree of self-determination, you want to stop that wheel once it has started to turn at your own peril. And so we said, this way of doing politics, going back to the olden days, will only pit you against the peoples of Ethiopia. And in no time, it started this violent confrontation with the Sidama nation, which was demanding their own state, with their own state as a constitutive of the federation. And he had to kill about 167 people in one day because people wanted a referendum to have their own state in Sidama. And then violence started to erupt everywhere. And finally, we have this genocidal war in Tigray. So that is the politics of Abiy Ahmed.
Well, Dr. Tsegaye, there's so much, and everybody share this. There's a genocide taking place in Tigray, treason taking place throughout Ethiopia. A lot of what we're discussing that we are speaking of that is taking place right now has been taking place for a long time, and there is an agenda at foot. I hope everyone has listened to Dr. Tsegaye outline what I understand as democracy. That's all he's talking about is rule of law, democracy, a constitution, and following the will of the people. And when you say what Abiy Ahmed wants, no one cares what he wants in a democracy because a democracy is not about a monarchy. Democracy is not about a king. Democracy is not about patriarchy. Democracy is not about what father knows best. Democracy is not rooted in any of that. And with that being said, how can you have an election and have any sense of validity attached to a democratic election when you've got opposition leaders incarcerated, genocide in other areas, and every state that I'm hearing of, there's some sort of dysfunction and mayhem? Who is going to take this so-called June election seriously? And please speak to the coming election and your thoughts attached to said election.
Yes, the election that Abiy wants is an election that is meant to consolidate his own power. In fact, I have been saying that what Abiy wants is not a democratic election. What he wants is an election that will basically usher in his coronation. And he wants to use the election as a form of legitimization, but it doesn't even get that far. But he's just using election as a language of getting international legitimacy. The international community will accept someone who has been put in the position of power through some kind of election. So he is deploying the language of election and the language of democracy to just say, look, I'm conducting election and this is what you want and, this is what I'm giving you. But other than that, he's not even interested in appealing to the people in the name of election. For that matter, it is only one party that is running virtually. There are other small parties that he tries to bring up as a way of showing how democratic he is. But the small parties are usually, 2-3 people member party. And most of them are basically in support of the continuation of his regime. Other than that, all the large opposition political parties are either pushed out of the political space, like the OLF, the OFC, the Oromo Federalist Congress, the Oromo Liberation Front in Oromia. In the absence of these two, the Oromo people are not in election. They are just because they have no representative. They have no Oromo party at all taking place in the election process. And in Tigray, there is no election. Of course, there shouldn't have been an election in the first place because they had an elected government anyway. But because of the war now, there is no election in Tigray. Just yesterday, the National Electoral Board issued a declaration that there will be no election in Harari region, one of the constituent units of the federation. There will be no election in the Somali region, another constituent unit of the federation. There will be no election in some parts of the southern region, in some parts of Benishangul Gumuz, and already some parts of Oromia because of security situation. Where does that leave us? We have 4 regions in which there will be no election, out of 9, out of 10. Okay. We have parts of 3 regions in which there will be no election. So basically, there are only 3 regions in which election will be conducted, and parts of 3 other regions in which election is being conducted. And the election is being conducted without any political opposition, any serious, meaningful political opposition party taking part in it. The election is conducted in a situation where people have mass grievances because of abuse of human rights, because of violence, because of suppression of their right to statehood in Walaita, for example, in various southern region, in various parts of the peoples of the southern region. They have this aspiration to be states member, constituting the federation, and that has been outlawed. And there is a huge sense of grievance, lots of economic difficulties going on, complete insecurity and unrest, complete dysfunctionality of government. There are no public services and social services being given by the government, because it's really the government that is embattled on many fronts and is not able to provide any social and public services. If you talk in terms of electricity, in terms of telecommunication, in terms of health facilities, health services, all these things are stuck. We are in a state of COVID-19 pandemic, and people are dying here and there. No one is even paying attention. It is in these circumstances that he is talking about election. And the only reason he's hanging on to this idea of election is because that's the language that the West understands, that somehow they say an imperfect election is better than no election. So they kind of step back and watch when you talk about election. And some of them they say, okay, if there is an opening for election, let's support the civil society organizations, the political parties, the media, and so on, so that some kind of democracy will come on a graded level. And they kind of tolerate any dictator who talks the language of election. So he is now using election as the last card to have a hearing among Western countries. Otherwise, he knows that even by Ethiopian standards, there is no election. He said, we have won the election, by the way, in a leaked recording that was released when he had a closed meeting in his party. He said, we have won the election already. Just don't make any mistakes that people will criticize us for. We have won the election. It's no question about it. And so even he doesn't believe that this is an election, really. He's just using it as the last card to lull the minds and hearts of the Western countries, who kind of have a soft spot for democracy and for the language of democracy.
Well, when I think about democracy, I know what it is, and I certainly know what it isn't. When you lock up and you don't allow for media, journalism, communication, elections, freedom in general, I personally know a little bit about what democracy looks like and feels like, and everything that I'm looking at and hearing and seeing in Ethiopia as we see it now has nothing to do with democracy. And if I see it, I know these world leaders see it. What about the African Union? Like, does the African Union see this? And remember, everyone said there would be no more genocide after Rwanda, which took place over 100 days. We are 220 days into a genocide in Tigray. World leaders are starting to use the words ethnic cleansing, genocide. They're demanding Eritrean troops out of Tigray. We've got proclamations and resolutions and great speeches. And now I'm just starting to hear womp, womp, womp. Because the same thing that I heard 100 days, 1 day, 5 days, and I'm hearing the same thing 220 days from these world leaders. Where's the African Union, and what is it going to take to stop the genocide in Tigray?
It's very unfortunate that the African Union indeed is missing in action. I think it is not an exaggeration to say that the African Union in this situation is missing in action, because we all know that the African Union is a very weak regional organization. Yes. The only time the African Union was very powerful and strong, at least had a very strong moral position, was when it acted against decolonization. I mean, it acted on behalf of decolonization to make sure that all colonized countries are unconditionally freed from any colonial occupation. When it insisted on the freedom of the Southwest Africa, which is Namibia, when it insisted on the eradication of apartheid in South Africa. In all these situations, the African Union was very, very strong. It was then called the Organization of African Unity. But apart from that, the African Union, because in part it was caught in between the Cold War politics of the superpowers, in part because it was simply an association of themselves and democratic leaders in various parts of Africa for a long time. And any regional organization is only as good as its members. And most of these leaders that are in power in Africa, in different parts of Africa, will come together in the African Union and basically just encourage each other and go away, and kind of covering for one another and going back to do things as usual. And let's not also forget that everything that has happened, every evil that has happened in Africa happened while the African Union in Addis Ababa is sitting and watching. I remember the Eritrean president in 1991 bashing the African Union, saying, for 30 years we were fighting for our liberation, and the African Union was right here in Addis Ababa, and it has said nothing. Okay, and when Rwanda happened, the African Union was sitting in Addis Ababa. When the Tigray, the Darfur happened, the African Union was in Addis Ababa. Did it do anything significant? No. When atrocities happened in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and all sorts of tragedy happened in Congo, the African Union was still there. But most of the time, it was missing in action. Why? Because it is only as strong as the countries that constitute it. The countries that constitute it are led by undemocratic leaders themselves. And so when they come together, they find it very difficult to criticize one another. There have been many innovations to deepen democracy in Africa, to encourage African leaders to really take democracy to heart. There have been innovations, activities done by eminent personalities, groups, by Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa, who pushed the NEPAD idea. A number of initiatives have been there, but it didn't take root because again, as long as there is no democracy in the countries that constitute the African Union cannot speak in one voice on behalf of democracy, human rights, and social justice. That is what we see. And let's remember, given the fact that it is in Addis Ababa, it's also under strong pressure by the Ethiopian government. Of course, they have sovereign immunity. They are diplomatic immunity. But because it is physically in there, it has been subjected to all sorts of surveillance and manipulation and pressure by the Ethiopian government and its security forces. Because if you look at the African Union building, the security service given to it is given by the Ethiopian government or people employed from Ethiopia. And that's where the Ethiopian government has a lot of influence on the African Union. So there are ways of intimidating particular diplomats into silence, ways of manipulating particular diplomats in Addis Ababa. And so the African Union, obviously, for most part, it is missing in action. What about the other members of the international body? The international community is finally taking this seriously. And of course, the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, the United Nations, all of these organizations are seized with the matter, and they are trying to do what they can. In fact, it looks like they are running out of patience, and they have been saying, now it's time for action. We need to act before more tragedy can happen, which is really heartening for me as an Ethiopian, as an Oromo person who is concerned about the entire region. And it's heartening, but still, they need to act and act fast to stop this madness and to arrest the genocide and to stabilize Ethiopia. I think it is important for them to act very strongly to arrest the genocidal members of the Abiy's regime and to bring them to court and make them accountable. Until that happens, no talk of election, no talk of diplomatic pressure, no nice language about human rights and so on and so forth will solve anything on the ground. And as we speak, people are dying, people are being displaced, people are flying into status of being refugees, and you know, that tragedy should stop and should stop if there is an international conscience that really cares for humanity that's suffering in that part of the world.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, it's been great just beginning our conversation, because we've got a lot more conversations that we've got to have and share. There are a lot of good, well-meaning humanitarians around the world that are standing up. They're saying no to genocide. They know that looting and rape and using food as a weapon and attacking citizens and all of these things in the form of a grab for power, 210 days, 220 days. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We've got to stop this genocide. I do want to ask, before we get out of here, a couple of things, especially that I noticed when we're talking about the color code, the caste systems. A lot of that is a byproduct of imperialism. A lot of that is the byproduct of the scramble for Africa. A lot of that is the byproduct of colonialism. We're looking at neo-colonialism. I'm wondering if we can find the cues and know that from a monarchy, you have folks rising up against monarchies, and then they find themselves under the government that says, well, the people aren't ready to govern themselves, so we need to form a committee. Because the Derg just means committee. Yes. Like, Derg means committee. And so the people say, well, we got to rise up and get rid of this committee. And right when they get rid of the committee, the folks in Eritrea start a committee. They start ruling by committee. And you start having all of these tragedies or these historical moments when they launch their shenanigans. For example, the committee right now that was a 15 in Eritrea whittled down to 1 post 9/11, while the U.S. was distracted with the 9/11 and the world was looking that way. Here we go, move, and now even that little committee is whittled down to you have one standing person, and that's Isaias Afwerki. During the time where there's an election taking place, all of a sudden it's time to launch in a war while the world or everybody's looking in a different direction. I mean, you start seeing these patterns that take place. What is the impact of Hachalu, the singer, the entertainer, the voice who's putting messages in music, etc.? All of a sudden there's a death, a murder, or whatever it is, and then here's some political arrests taking place. When are we going to see these distractions as distractions and set aside our grievances and really push for democracy? Is Ethiopia able to do that, or will it continually be defined by the grievances it has across cultures? Or is it just the next strong man up? What's your vision for Ethiopia, and how do you get there?
Yes, I'm glad you raised Hachalu Hundesa's assassination as a sad moment in the last year, and as a beginning of as a moment when the political leaders in Oromia have been arrested. Yes, Hachalu Hundesa has been really the iconic, epic singer and songwriter of the Oromo protest movement. He has been his voice has been virtually the soundtrack of the Oromo revolution between 2014 and 2018. And he has, even Hachalu had this hope that through Abiy's leadership, somehow we are going to rebuild the country. I remember his last song on stage asking this question, rhetorically, is it then true that the Oromo will destroy the nation? Are we not building the nation up? And so that was his last song. And I said that was a huge optimism that at last the Oromo is in charge, and the Oromo is going to try to rebuild the country and usher in an era of democracy. But unfortunately, Hachalu himself was assassinated because he's a voice of, to a certain extent, Oromo nationalism, a voice that emboldens the Oromo quest for self-respect, enriches its self-esteem, and gives some optimism about our place in the world, our place in the nation. And he was sadly assassinated on June 30th, 2020. And after that time, the relationship between Ethiopia and Oromia has never been the same. I think it was the last bridge collapsing between the Oromo people on the one hand and the Ethiopian state on the other. And I think from that day on, Oromos will never, it's almost like now the Tagaru have despaired on Ethiopia. After this genocide, the last bridge they have between their people and the Ethiopian state has completely been obliterated. And it's because of that many Tagarus today are talking about having their own country, Agara Tigray. They want to have an independent Tigrayan nation that can have, that can be safe from this onslaught of attacks by Ethiopia in different forms, in war and direct attack and violence, in reclamation of their territories, and in subjecting them to a fabricated famine, a generated mass starvation. And they think that the only way they can be safe from all this and to survive in the world with dignity of their culture and identity is to have their own independent state. Now, I understand their frustration, and I think they are within their right to say that, and within their constitutional right, if right in Ethiopia. But again, it's also important to remember that we are in a region that is geostrategically globalized, because many global forces are interested in the area, and a region that is extremely volatile, a region of peoples with a lot of interdependence and interlocked cultural and environmental relationships. And so it is going to be tough. And I think whoever wants to deal with Tigray now has to do by doing a very serious, genuine concern for their people and acknowledgement of their legitimate situation, their legitimate claim, and do it on equal basis. It can't be done otherwise. Now, that aside, in Ethiopia generally, what is the hope? And I believe to fix Ethiopia's problems does not warrant, simple solutions cannot be, there is no simple solution for that. It's a very complex country. It's a country of complex relationships of many groups, a country whose external relations is complicated because of the fact that the region is geostrategically very globalized. Many global forces are interested in it, from far and near. I mean, the Middle East is close by. There is the imperial ambitions of all sorts of forces, whether it is America or Europe or Turkey or China, etc. So the region is geostrategically extremely globalized, and externally. Internally, this is an area which is a country of shared fragility. You have the Somali, with one part of it is failed state, another part of it de facto independent, Somaliland. You have South Sudan, which in itself is having a problem. Sudan, it's in transition to democracy. Eritrea, the monster that it is.
With a genocide taking place, we can't let anything stand in our way of getting this information to the people. We can't, in the information that you're sharing, there are a couple of things that I want to just get before we get out of here. I really want to see your vision in terms of Is Ethiopia unraveling as we know it, or is there a chance to move beyond the hurts of the past into the promise of the future? Dr. Tsegaye, what are your thoughts?
Yes, it's very unfortunate that we are seeing the unraveling of Ethiopia, unfortunately, but it could have been prevented. And I think there is still a chance to prevent the unraveling of Ethiopia. The reason is because of the fact that the area, as I said, is very much composed of people who have interdependence, common fragility, and because we are trapped in a geostrategically globalized corner of the world. And the world is not interested in dealing with small, weak states that are inviable and that will be constantly in conflict with one another. Because the problem with unraveling of a particular country through self-determination is that it leaves some wounds open, because the rump state will be bleeding and it feels that it has to take vengeance on the newly independent state. And it's not easy to deal with that kind of wound, because every separation leaves some kind of wound behind. And so the world is not ready to risk the proliferation of new states that will be at loggerheads with one another. And I think that is part of the reason why the international community is cautious in endorsing moves towards self-determination in the area and even in other places. Self-determination is often as a last option for a people that have no way of being protected from abuse in the current situation. A case in point is Kosovo. There is nothing that suggests that Kosovo would be a viable state on its own. But there was no way also making sure that the members of that country can be safe in a context where Serbia and all the other forces in the region are going to unleash their violence again and again on that people, and they are not expecting for anything less than elimination of that people. So the UN had to somehow find a way of ensuring that Kosovo becomes a self-determining nation. And in the same way, now we see the Tigray intending to assure itself of its own safety and security through only declaring independence. And there are many more that are in waiting. Oromia has long been fighting a war of self-determination. The Oromo Liberation Front's declared program is the achievement of self-determination for our peoples and creation of an independent Republic of Oromia, a Gada Republic, Gada Democratic Republic. And of course, they have all scaled down their ambitions over the last 3 years. The Oromo Liberation Front scaled down its independence, its ambitions towards independence, because they said independence is something to be decided upon by the people through a referendum. And that can happen only if there is a democratic dispensation. So the priority now, they said, is to push for democratic transition while we have an Oromo person in office, which is Abiy Ahmed, who was hailed as a reformist at the start of his assumption of power. So the Oromo Liberation Front went home, not being uninterested in in the creation of an independent state, but in the hope that there will be a democratic provenance within the context of which people will have a say whether they want to be independent or stay within Ethiopia. And some of them gave a hope to a democratized Ethiopia to be fair and just to all the groups, including Oromia, which is very much at the center, at the heart of the geographic region called Ethiopia. So there are many more who are aspiring for statehood. And there have been about 12 groups in the southern region who are looking for their own states, not independent states separate from Ethiopia, but states constituting the federation within Ethiopia. And they also want to exercise self-determination, a referendum to constitute a separate state, as opposed to being a small locality or having a local government within the southern nation's nationalities regional state. That region, by the way, is a federation within a federation. It's more like Bosnia in Yugoslavia, you know. In Bosnia, you have Bosnians, you have Serbians, you have Croatians, but it is a Bosnian region, you know. It's a federation within a federation. So because of that, there is all this. Now, I said it is preventable. That unraveling is preventable because we had a constitutional framework that will allow everyone to govern itself, that will allow everyone safety and protection from the center, that will allow everyone to have its own local government, to have a shared governance in the Ethiopian region. There are institutions, the House of Federation, which is a representative of all nations and nationalities at the federal level. And there are things that we have to change in the area of protection of minorities, in the area of equalization of smaller groups with bigger groups in the country, you know, in the name of justice. There are things that we have to tweak about the Constitution. However, the fundamental structure of the Constitution allows for justice, for social justice, for self-determination, local self-rule, for protection of human rights, because the Constitution has about 31 articles dedicated only to protection of human rights. A whole chapter is devoted to protection of human rights of individuals and groups. You know, it's very interesting. You can name any document in the International Bill of Rights, you know, the UDHR, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, all of those things are in there. We have institutions of human rights protection, like the National Human Rights Commission. We have the institution of Ombudsman, and so on and so forth. Given that framework, you know, unraveling would have been unnecessary. The problem with Ethiopia is that the constitutional framework, the multinational federal setup, has never been tried in full. It's not that it has been tried and been found wanting. It is just that it is left untried, and it was subverted by the imperial nostalgia among the Amhara political elite, who still insist on Amhara supremacist ideology, and which is now controlling Abiy's political vision in the country. So what should we do in order to prevent this unraveling and to make transition to democracy smooth in Ethiopia? I think the first thing to do now is to arrest the genocide. I think if necessary, by taking an international military action. I mean, NATO has intervened in Kosovo, NATO has intervened in Bosnia, NATO has intervened in Yugoslavia to stop and arrest the genocide. And because of that, today we have people that at least survived that tragedy. It could have been a repeat of Rwanda, and President Clinton learned his lessons from the neglect of Rwanda, and he acted through NATO, and it led to the saving of some people. I think the international community have the responsibility now to act on behalf of Tigray, to arrest the genocide going on in Ethiopia, and to allow access, humanitarian access to the people in need, and to stop the madness in Ethiopia and in the region, because Eritrea is also acting regionally. So that's the first step to take. By hook or crook, we need to stop this genocidal war. That's the number one task. Second, allow humanitarian aid access to the people unconditionally. And third, remove the Eritrean forces from Oromia, from Tigray, from anywhere they are operating. In Benishangul Gumuz, as I said, they are already deployed in Benishangul Gumuz as well. Yeah, you know, so these three things are very much key to stabilizing the area. The fourth thing to do is for Abiy Ahmed to, I don't think Abiy Ahmed should be sitting with anyone for negotiation, because I believe he is A, treasonous for Ethiopians, and B, a man who has orchestrated and prosecuted a genocidal war. And I think he has to be arrested, he has to be He has to be held accountable, and his group, his entire group, have to be held accountable for the genocide that is happening in Tigray and in other parts of Ethiopia. But Ethiopian political leadership, the Ethiopian political class, from all corners, all factions, all stakeholders, have to come to an internationally brokered negotiating table. We have been calling for Abiy to have an all-inclusive negotiation among all political stakeholders. He refused to do that. He said it to Jeffrey Feltman. He said it to Senator Chris Coons, and I don't think he's agreeing to that now. And even if he does, most of the political opposition people feel unhappy, feel compromised to be sitting with a genocidal leader and negotiating a peace deal to the future. No, I don't think that will happen. I think the international community should intervene to stop the humanitarian crisis, should stop the genocide, should kick out Abiy Ahmed and make them accountable legally and for their atrocities, and then convene an internationally brokered political negotiation, an all-inclusive political negotiation towards a transition. To do that, you only need to agree on a small, thin roadmap towards when we are going to have election, a roadmap towards a democratic election. Once that is done, we'll go back to the constitutional signposts and all the other things, all the tensions among ethnic groups, among different regions. All those things can be absorbed and properly addressed through the constitution. So we have that first important roadmap, agreed upon roadmap towards transition. And if we do achieve the transitional first democratic election, then all the other things, all the other issues, all the other political conflicts will be resolved through the constitutional framework we have. And that means respect for the multinational federal structure and allow for people to express themselves and govern themselves at a state level, at the local level, and express their national aspirations for self-determination through a democratic referendum. And I think once we have that democratic election, that democratically elected body will table demands for referendum in different parts of the country. And through that referendum, I am sure people are going to vote for more interdependence, for living together in a respectable, human rights sensitive and justice-oriented, social justice-oriented framework. And I think the constitutional structure will be the one that will help to resolve those problems. Now, in saying this, I am saying that there is no post-federalist moment in Ethiopia. I have long been saying there will be no way we can steer away from the federalist structure that we have. We can only have more federalism, more autonomy, not less. Which means then Ethiopia can be prevented from unraveling, can have its problems solved, can reconstitute itself as a strong East Africa country, as a strong, peaceful, stable economic powerhouse in the region, only if it looks back to its constitutional signposts and tweak that constitution in such a way that it will give more recognition, more power to the minority groups in the country. As we speak, we have spoken about the genocide in Tigray. We have spoken about the onslaught, the military operations in Oromia, but we have not spoken about the genocide that is being conducted in the Amhara region on the Command people. The genocide that is conducted within the Amhara region on the Agao people. And the violence that is meted out by the social vigilante groups in the Amhara region to the border areas of Oromia and Benishangul Gumuz. And these things have to be addressed, and we need to tweak the constitution in such a way that we address the concerns of minority groups that are often unspoken about, but have been constantly under threat of elimination by whoever is dominant in their area. So having tweaked that, I think there is already the infrastructure of decolonization in Ethiopia, the infrastructure that we can use to dismantle the politics of empire in Ethiopia. And it's precisely because of that Abiy basically wants to tinker with the constitution in order to bring back the politics of empire. And I think because given the fact that we have that infrastructure within the constitution, I think the unraveling of Ethiopia can be prevented. But even if we go our own ways, I think it is possible to do that constitutionally, because the constitution allows the right to self-determination of every group in the country, the right to self-determination up to and including secession. And I think that's the only way we can go to a lasting peace in the region. And I think that's the only guarantee to peace in the Horn of Africa region, and the guarantee that the peoples in the Horn of Africa region can regroup on a voluntary basis in the form of confederation or federation, through voluntary association, to make sure that their interdependence, ecological, economic, and cultural interdependence is also sustained, and a lasting peace can reign in that area.
Wow, Dr. Tsegaye, I appreciate everything that you have shared with us. And if you're thinking about what you can do, you can share this information. Share it to someone and let them know that there is a genocide taking place in Tigray. Where's Tigray? North of Ethiopia, south of Eritrea, east of the Sudan, and in the hearts of the Tigray people throughout the diaspora. They're all in Denver, Colorado right now. They will be at Oxum Park on tomorrow. And it sounds like, Dr. Tsegaye, that we need to figure out a way to understand that the African continent was split up using divide and conquer. Like, it was divide and conquer. Ethiopia has over 80 various languages, which means ethnicities within inside of that landmass. And at some point, I believe that there's going to have to be a coalition of the oppressed, like a common suffering that can touch all of the individual states we talked about, and then move forward as a nation. And if you're able to do that, then you've taken a big step into the future, as opposed to saying, when I get into power, I'm going to oppress somebody else based on my past grievances, or based on your skin color, or based on your region, or based on anything that would divide us. And I think that's what you're saying. But Dr. Tsegaye, if I'm misquoting, please let me know. Is there a need for a coalition of the oppressed?
Absolutely. I think that's a very wonderful term that you have come up with. And we have been working on this, trying to create an alliance among various groups that are operating for, acting for and speaking for self-determination of various groups. In fact, we have a group called Multinational Federalist Support Group. We have been trying to put up a coalition of the oppressed, as you said. Unfortunately, we have been overtaken by this genocidal war. And every day we had to try to address this and that problem coming from the Tigrayan region, just to get the story out, from Oromia, from Tigray, because it was happening under a blockade of communication. That kept us so busy that we couldn't even have a breathing space within which to talk about the common strategies we have to identify in order to bring the coalition of the oppressed into the picture, and to be able to negotiate a very sustainable future as peoples of Ethiopia. As you know, Ethiopia has been called long ago by a very famous Italian scholar, anthropologist, a colonial scholar at that. Ethiopia has been referred to as a museum of peoples, Museo di Popoli. And later on, during the student movement, the Ethiopian student revolutionaries called Ethiopia as a prison house. They called it a prison house of nationalities. And for the last many years, after the prison has been broken free in 1991, because of the ushering in of the right to self-determination through the constitution, Ethiopia has been less of a prison, but more of a museum, once again, more of a museum. But now, even existence in that museum is disallowed by Abiy's regime. It's like he said, we are against politics of identity. We are against organizing ourselves in terms of nations and nationalities and peoples. We are against the right of self-determination. What he was basically saying is we don't, and recently he has been on record saying that we are a people, we are not peoples of Ethiopia. In effect, he is saying, I don't accept the plurality that is reigning supreme in this area. And he is trying to create making Ethiopia a melting pot, e pluribus unum, when in actual fact, that model doesn't work for Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, if you want a maxim, a Latin maxim for it, what the model that works is plures in uno, many in one, preservation and protection of the many in one country. This genocidal war is making it impossible for us to exist as plures in uno. That's basically what is happening. The acting against federalism, the acting against multinational pluralism, the acting against diversity is basically saying it's impossible for you to exist in this museum. And we want to go back to make it a prison house once again. And I don't think anyone can accept that. And I think Ethiopia has these people who can coexist because, as I said, their fate is interlocked because of economic interdependence, because of the common fragility, because of environmental, ecological interdependence, because we are locked in a geostrategically globalized center. And because of this, it is important for us, the coalition of the oppressed, to come together and to try to find ways of living together peacefully, respectfully, and in a context where there is a flourishing of democracy and human and protection of human rights.